Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1022nd New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Prem Krishnamurthy and Jonathan T.D. Neal. And now I'll introduce Prem and Jonathan. Prem Krishnamurthy is a designer, author, and educator. His multifaceted work explores the role of art as an agent of transformation at an individual, collective, and structural level. He received the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Communications Design in 2015 and the KW Institute for Contemporary Arts A Year With Residency Fellowship in 2018. He has curated several large-scale exhibitions, including Front International 2022, Oh, Gods of Dust and Rainbows. His book-length epistolary essay on letters was published in 2022. He currently directs workshops in Department of Transformation. And our host today, Jonathan T.D. Neal, was editor of the Held Essays on Visual Art for the Brooklyn Rail from 2011 to 2015, and we're lucky to have Jonathan as a contributor to the Rail now. Currently, he is co-founder of Inversion Art, a startup that provides investment strategy and management services to visual artists. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan to get us started. And please hang on to the very end today because we've got a surprise performance at the end for all of you.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Eleanor, Carolyn, everybody at the Rail. And most of all, thank you to my friend and colleague, Prem, for coming on to this new social environment to talk a little bit about your current and previous endeavors in the art and cultural sector. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's so great to be here. And thanks everyone for showing up at lunchtime or wherever you are. Maybe it's another time zone.
So we'll get things started. I think at the sort of present moment here, you are currently a resident at a relatively new arts and cultural space in New York City. And as part of that residency, you are manifesting or presenting or organizing and conducting, orchestrating. There's so many different verbs one could use to talk about how it is
Love
that
them.
you engage in these projects. So to begin, tell us a little bit about this residency, and most of all, tell us a little bit about the Department of Transformation, and what it is, how it came to be, where I can get one of those sweet T-shirts that you're wearing right now, and set the groundwork for us here.
Cool. Well, Canal Projects is a new nonprofit. I think it's been around for about a year and a half, 2 years. It's run by Summer Guthrie, who you probably know, Jonathan, from LA, and Joan. But they have an exhibition, ambitions exhibition program that usually offers artists who haven't shown in New York a kind of first institutional show. And they also have in parallel a kind of library artist or group in residence. That's something where they invite artist groups to come and be there, do their research from a kind of lower level space. And so I was very lucky that Canal Projects invited me and Department of Transformation to show up there. Last year, in the beginning of the year, Department of Transformation was on a teaching tour around the whole US. So it went to about 10 cities and art schools, museums, nonprofits, and agricultural research institute, trying to share some frameworks for art and transformation and also some specific collaboration tools. Like, how do we teach active listening, empathic feedback, conflict awareness as part of the tool set that artists and designers carry with them? And now Department of Transformation has landed at Canal Projects until the middle of June. And it's just an opportunity to actually ground ourselves a little bit, be in one space, get to meet with interesting artists, designers, curators, thinkers, therapists that we are curious about, and try to learn from their methodologies, try to kind of build a body of methods and tools that can be part of what Department of Transformation is doing.
How does this connect up to your previous work as a designer, as an artist, as a curator, um, again, as a kind of orchestrator of convenings, of people and ideas. I've known you since the days of projects in New York City and of P exclamation, the titular sort of gallery space, though it was so much more than that, than just a sort of standard gallery space that you had on the Lower East Side. So how is Department of Transformation a culmination or an extension of some of these earlier activities that you've been involved in, both as the generator as well as a participant?
Well, for better or for worse, I find that my own life keeps transforming. Roughly every about 5 years, I seem to either add or subtract some sort of career path. I mean, I studied art and design originally and went into graphic design because it seemed like a really powerful form of communicating beyond the kind of bubble of the white cube. It seemed like a way that you could make objects and messages that would reach out into the world and encounter new people. So I started that studio, Project Projects, which in 2018 became Workshops, the graphic design studio I'm part of now. And at the same time, in parallel, in from 2012 to 2017, I started an experimental gallery called P exclamation in Chinatown on Broome Street. And P really saw itself as this meeting point for art and design and music and writing. You could keep adding ands, but to me, it was moving away from the model of a kind of monovocal space that showed only solo shows by artists, though it did do that too, but it tried to involve artists in more collaborative relationships and create, connections between these different fields and ideas. I think that at some point I realized that actually all of these different things I'd been doing, whether it was running a graphic design studio, opening a gallery, also helping to found a magazine called Paper Monument, together with Roger White, Dushko Petrovich, and other folks, I realized that all these things were a kind of community building. They were about bringing people who are different together. And maybe that was most evident in the teaching work that I was doing throughout this entire period. I mean, from basically since I first had a graphic design studio, I mean, I was probably way too young to even be teaching then. I remember I was always like, wow, I'm only like 3 or 4 years older than the people who are in my classes. But still, I was trying to think about how to bring collaborative methods into teaching, because that was something that we never learned in school. In school, we only learned how to work as kind of solo individuals, and becoming a graphic designer, I realized that's just never the way that you work, whether as an artist or a graphic designer or a human being. And I think this really came to a head in the pandemic, where suddenly we had this crisis of community. Suddenly everything shut down and we were isolated, both physically and oftentimes socially, from other people. And so it seemed even more essential to figure out platforms for how to bring people together. So I started to experiment with Zoom, experiment with other kind of meeting technologies, working with students and other people to create these experimental gatherings that often looked at the dynamics of communities themselves. And I think that that's really like, for better for worse, I mean, I'm sure, I would imagine for all the people here, I mean, how many people, maybe you can raise a hand or put something in the chat. I mean, for how many of you was the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, a kind of transformative moment? I definitely see some hands raising and people waving. I mean, I think for so many people, it was a pivoting point, even if in my mind, I've already forgotten so many parts of it. It's like the human mind is built to forget things that are painful or challenging. That's one of the ways it heals itself. But I think that moment really coalesced the fact that what I was working on were questions of like new models, new formats for togetherness.
It's interesting. This is a little bit of a extension of that, but as you were talking, it sort of occurred to me that there's a kind of a moment of self-reflexivity in a way that brings this interest in community or gathering to its own kind of logical end. So if you sort of begin as a graphic designer, and art and design, but with an idea of doing projects, bringing people together for a sort of specific goal or specific purpose, right? There's usually like an outcome involved in sort of those collaborative activities. Maybe I think this happens before the pandemic, but pandemic maybe is something that codifies it or makes it very salient. There becomes a moment where like community for community's own sake becomes the the ethos or the the let's, for lack of a better word, the kind of philosophy behind what's happening, right? And so it almost reminds me of this kind of prior moment, late 19th, early 20th century, art for art's sake, sensibility of modernism. Now, fast forward 100 years to this kind of community or gathering for community and gathering's sake. Is there, have you thought about it in those specific terms, in terms of a kind of a legacy of a almost of community or gathering or collaboration as a medium that has its own specificity, that when it turns on itself begins to sort of explore its own extents and its own kind of constituent elements?
It's a fantastic question. I think you're onto something there because, I think the community as a form, it's a big word that is sometimes it becomes almost meaningless because we talk about so many things as community. And but to me, there's a specificity in the forms of gathering and of how people come together. I think a lot about the kind of power structures and dynamics of groups. I mean, one thing is that we often think that community is formed, or I shouldn't say we, because who is the we? I don't know who the we is. I think, but I'd say, I've encountered myself, I've sometimes used the word community uncritically, where it's like, oh, you gather a group of people together. Great, that's a thing. And I mean, I think we saw that in some ways in the 90s when I was coming up, and things like relational aesthetics and participatory art that was all about gathering people together through certain platforms or certain architectural or gallery or installation forms. But to me, what's become more and more interesting, and this is partially my background as a designer, is are the kind of rules or the formats of gathering. Because I think that when you have a so-called unstructured gathering, it often defaults into kind of emphasizing or empowering the voices that are already empowered. I think a lot about the feminist text, the seminal feminist text, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, by Joe Freeman. And, that's a text about how in the 70s and these feminist activist groups, whenever you had this idea that, oh, we don't need a hierarchy, it's all going to be democratic, you end up reinforcing the structures that exist. And so I've found myself more and more trying to observe different models and say, like, what are the ways that these groups organize themselves, and how can you take some of those protocols, some of those methods, into another gathering with a kind of self-reflexivity, a self-awareness about it that allows people to kind of tweak those engagements. So yeah, I mean, like, for example, I've been in New York, I've been visiting out of interest Quaker meetings, and I find that to be a really interesting form, the way in which silence is used to both ground people individually and as a group, really as an almost meditative form, but then also how people are given specific opportunities where they can step forward and speak speak their mind, speak what comes to them, but they're also asked to do so once during a meeting, not many times. And so it creates a certain structure that, I think we can learn from. It's actually, some of those forms might be useful in totally different contexts. Maybe we should start kind of gatherings or classes with a couple of minutes of silence for everybody to just kind of land where they are, ground their body. And then actually, I find that many times in my teaching, if you just if people just jump in and answer questions or pose questions, it actually privilege is those who already feel like they have a, they feel like they have a loud enough voice. Their gender and their position in the world allows them to do that. Whereas sometimes if you're actually let the silence sit or give people other modes to communicate, like writing things down or, giving questions in different modes, that's even why the chat in a Zoom is useful. I think it allows different points of access, different people to be part of a conversation.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Because it occurs to me, I'm glad you mentioned relational aesthetics and the kind of aesthetics of participation, because there's sort of some of these moments where, when pushed to an extreme, the uh, the the sensibility like moves into a kind of like radical either parody or like or is pushed beyond sort of recognition in terms of what something could look like. And I'm thinking here particularly of one of the collaborators for Department of Transportation. I think it's Naoko. Forgive me the name, Wasugi or Wasuji. Um,
Wasugi, yeah.
Wasugi, has sort of conducted this kind of, I think in one place it was described as a kind of like becoming a super participant, right? And engaging and being involved in like many other artists and organizations activities and engagements and initiatives, and then kind of reporting back on that, and even the sort of writing about that participatory activity, you know, to me, it was it pushed out to the outer boundary about what participation could be. And my first reaction was like, oh, this is silly. And then as I thought about it more, I thought to myself, well, actually, there's something, this is something that an artist kind of does almost in this kind of avant-gardist or Dadaist mode, but now applied to the vernaculars or the language of our sort of organizational structures and our power structures and these dynamics of being together. And so I'm sort of curious for you, you know, because I see Department of Transportation, and I know you and the projects you've been involved in is always sort of has a kind of aesthetics of kind of joy and seriousness combined, right? Like, and the sort of the avant-gardist or the Dadaist sensibility is not something that's like kept necessarily at bay, but it's sort of, I would say, might be in the space outside one of your very beautiful kind of diagrams about the sort of the way that things operate. And so I'm curious to you how you think about that line between the kind of the joyful and the ecstatic, right? Which I think is also something that your work and Department of Transportation and a lot of these kinds of gatherings of people is trying to get after. Is sort of like other ways of being together that move up onto experiences that are perhaps something more than just instrumentalized or more than just goal oriented, but themselves have a kind of an affective quality to them. How do you manage that sort of that sense of joy pushing over into like the absurd or pushing over into areas that would be something, I don't know, other than the kind of seriousness that you approach your own work? Another kind of baggy question, apologies.
No, no need for apologies. I appreciate it because yeah, I mean, somehow I think it's a good baggy question because it's a good baggy territory. I think
Right.
that part of it is that um, so much of how I was like trained and learned art was so much about this kind of rationality. I mean, particularly also in graphic design, which is often thought about as being a functional problem solving out of this modernist lineage. And it's taken me a lot of decades to unlearn that and to realize that joy is also a really powerful mode. It's something that it's both effective at sometimes helping you to integrate challenging things, to move through tough situations, to also deal with really complex material and content. And it also has something that's even much more than that, that I can't even quite theorize, where, joy can do a lot. And I feel like in many cases, we've lost this sense of joy and its power. I mean, I think a lot about I think a lot about Audre Lorde, and Audre Lorde has this great line in The Uses of the Erotic where she talks about how the experience of joy can help bring people who are different together, how it can help lessen the threat of their difference. And so that's really important to me. But I think what you were getting at in your question with Naoko Wasugi's work, and in particular her kind of secret project in which she was a hyper participant in other artists' projects, I think there's something that really appealed to me about that because not only because it changes the terms of what art is or can be, but also, I mean, it has a historical dimension too. I think a lot about Alan Capro and his work in the 1950s and 60s and onward. I was recently in his archive at the Getty Research Center in LA and found some fascinating materials. But I think that, I think that like we live in this moment where art is often equated with valuable objects that are bought and sold. I think we think that art sometimes is the product, whereas I think a friend of mine named Philip Niemeyer, who runs a great gallery in Austin, Texas called Northern Southern, he once said to me, he said, art's not a what, it's a how. And I do think that there's something about reframing art and design, reframing what they might be, not only for now, but also in the future. That seems really important to me. And I think that's maybe the first step of what is Department of Transformation trying to do. I think in some small way, I mean, it sounds like a big goal, but I'll say it's trying to one step at a time, maybe one conversation at a time, reframe what art and design can do in the world beyond the kind of very limited role that they're sometimes ascribed right now.
Sure, sure. Let me ask this question. Again, probably pretty baggy.
Go for
What
it.
kind of what kind of transformation are you seeking? Um, and I guess, there's a I think in one of the sessions at Canal Projects underneath the auspices of Department of Transformation, that was a kind of question like, what is the transformation that you are seeking? What is the and I guess for me, I always, maybe this is just a product of like too much education, but it's like I want to drill down on some of these terms, which is why transformation, which in these contexts particularly feels like or sounds like something like self-transformation, which also implies a kind of dissatisfaction or a lack with the current state of things, right? And there's an inherent privileging of change over stasis or conservation. And so I'm curious what, you know, in the sort of, you've put together this entity which is an inherent play on an idea of the Department of Transportation for me, which living in Los Angeles just, evokes, shrieks of horror. But it's, I'm so curious to sort of to get into or dig into this idea of what is the transformation that's being sought after individually, collectively, and so forth.
So when I was kind of younger, I mean, I come from a family of basically engineers, and uh, for me, art always seemed like this deeply selfish thing, seemed like a thing that you weren't allowed to do because, I mean, also as an immigrant, it was an impractical and selfish thing to do. And so when I was younger, the way that I tried to reconcile that was to think about art's social roles and to think how can art have a larger communal or structural dimension to it. And I think for me, thinking through and working through this question of transformation has been a way to reconcile those scales. I mean, you said something about how transformation and a focus on transformation suggests a dissatisfaction with the present or a focus on change. And for me, I'd frame that slightly differently, and I'd say I think change is the constant. Change is always happening, and we can try to run away from it. We can try to pretend that things are staying static, but the one thing we're all assured of beyond, you know, being born and dying is that things will change in the meantime. And so instead of it being a focus on transformation, it's more an attention to transformation. I think if we accept that change is always happening, the question is, what kind of change do we want? So I think about that on the individual level as the way that art, as a kind of daily practice, can help people to transform themselves. It can be liberatory on that level. And I think that's, you know, I mean, I imagine also, I mean, in the audience here, I mean, how many people here have some sort of daily creative practice or something they do often? I imagine there are a lot of artists and people in this crowd. Anybody write every day, draw every day, you know, do anything like that? Can we have a raise of hands? Can't actually see it right now. I mean, for me, I discovered this years ago where I was running a large design studio, kind of 15 to 20 person design studio. And I found that if most of my day was spent running around and managing other people, and I love people, but if I spent 15 minutes a day actually just writing or drawing or do something on my own, it would mean I had a better day. And I think in aggregate, those kind of small changes can be transformative. But then I also started to think over the last several years, you asked a question about joy before. And I think that that art can be deeply transformative on a collective level because of the dimension of joy. I mean, one of the things, again, coming from this insight from Audre Lorde, is that the sharing of joy can bring people together who might otherwise disagree or might otherwise, you know, they might have lots of things between them. And I think, you know, whether it's the experience of color, like a beautiful kind of artwork or a painting, or it's the experience of music, the experience of singing together, the experience of moving together, the experience of a space, all of these things. I mean, why do I go to exhibitions? Because ultimately I'm going to encounter things that are unfamiliar to me and maybe encounter unfamiliar people as well. And it's that kind of joy, but joy conceived of as something that is also complex. It can be confusing and it has a kind of richness to it. It's not like simply like eating sugar. I think that kind of joy that art and the arts can produce is very important. I mean, I might be an optimist, but I do believe that if you sing together with somebody, you're less likely to shoot them. I think that there's something in that act of partaking in joy together, which again, as Audre Lorde said, helps lessen the threat of difference between people. But then I think that this transformation isn't only on the individual and collective level. I guess I also have the optimism that it can bubble up, that it can actually be structural and societal. And so when you ask about transformation, I think it might start from the small scale, but my belief is that it grows.
Interesting. I mean, I think that I like the belief that people who sing together are less likely to shoot one another. That feels though like it takes it to an extreme as well, though, right? I think what I'm sort of curious about is, you know, maybe it goes back to this kind of this sense of self-reflexivity and maybe joy, the experiences of joy in these collaborative or collective environments are the kinds of outcomes there. Because I think the other thing that strikes me about your work is that it does have this very, and I don't use this term negatively at all, but this kind of managerial sensibility and expertise to it, right? And even Department of Transportation, sorry, Department of Transformation, again, sorry, I just can't it's Los Angeles, it's got its hooks in me. Department of Transformation, it speaks this kind of language of the administrative and the managerial. And most of that, especially in, for example, these days also design schools, but business schools, schools of management, is often very much about getting groups of people to function effectively together towards common purpose of one sort of another, whether that's within a nonprofit organization with a mission-driven initiative, or whether it's a for-profit company with a bottom line and quarterly reports and deliverables that need to be gotten, or a product that needs to be, produced and gotten out the door. And it's kind of a way of getting, human capacity to its to its to a high functioning, let's say. And it's interesting that when you remove a sort of goal, right, or when you remove one of those missions or the outcomes, that the experiences that you're trying to create become kind of, let's say, abstract and in their sort of affective dimension. And maybe that's what I'm curious about, is the sort of use of this managerial vernacular and the managerial environment and the administrative aesthetic, which I think pervades to a certain extent, to achieve something like joy, right? Or to achieve something like a way of being together that has a kind of, in general, a kind of positive affective dimension, rather than what could also be the case is the kind of, experiences that are traumatic or difficult. And here I'm thinking, one of the materials that you point to as a resource, alongside of the texts like Joe Freeman's or some of the other sort of key sources for the Department of Transformation, are, for example, Lee Leder's film, The Task, which is, to me, a sort of brilliant epitome of a kind of collective tension, and I wouldn't use the word traumatic, but a kind of breakdown of structures and sensibilities when people gather, without a kind of shared purpose or outcome, except for the sort of purpose of being there together and exploring that collective sensibility. So I'm curious, in your mind, how you sort of navigate these, I wouldn't say it's like a risk. I'm not trying to suggest that there's some sort of like dark underbelly here, but I'm curious about the way that these kinds of often instances of being together, even when there is shared purposes, go awry, and what that looks like from the standpoint of Department of Transformation, even if it's as sort of mundane as thinking about, oh, we have to learn from our mistakes, right? Like learn from an experience that did not go the way that we wanted it to go, and thus learn from that and have that be part of our experiential education.
Right. I mean, The Task is a great example. It it was, in some ways, it was really core to the thinking that Tina Kukelski and I were doing when we started to conceptualize Front, the triennial in Cleveland that we co-artistic directed. Um, and I think that part of it is that tension, that unresolvable thing. It's a deeply uncomfortable situation, a group therapeutic situation where people are trying to talk about the power dynamics in the room. And ultimately, it's even complicated further by the fact that Lee, as an artist, steps in at the end and kind of breaks this wall from being the filmmaker into being a participant, and creates this kind of intervention that messes with the whole room. And but I do think that you're highlighting something when you talk about, the idea of collaboration in a corporate context. You're right. It's often driven towards a singular aim or goal. And I think that in some ways, I mean, sometimes the corporate world, in many cases, is actually far more, articulate and innovative in terms of methodologies. I mean, the way that we often learn how to make art, I think, is sometimes so far behind some of the ways of thinking that come out of programming, that come out of other contexts. My mother, was a roboticist and worked in programming. She's the first person who introduced me to the idea of pair programming and agile methodologies and things, because this was part and parcel of how she worked. That being said, I think that for example, the task is a great example because it's actually not about resolving that conflict. It's about sitting with it. And it's also how art can actually intervene in that to create something that gets a little under your skin. I don't think that anything is really resolved in that film, but I'd like to think, I mean, I went away from that film thinking about my interactions with other people in a very different way. It really stuck with me. And I do think that that's the kind of bumpiness that art can introduce, which is that as opposed to simply moving everything towards a singular goal, going towards one thing in the fastest way possible, it actually does the opposite. It slows things down. It adds a kind of friction that actually makes you take more care with the situations you're in. That to me is far more valuable because, you know, rather than having a single goal that you're moving towards, it allows people to move towards different goals. It allows them to take the tools that they're learning and then take them back into their homes or their families or their communities or the organizations they're part of and use them in the ways that make sense for that context, rather than saying, "Oh, we're all just trying to work towards one goal." It allows for a multiplicity of that. So I think that's where I see the difference. But yeah, and the question of the bureaucratic nature, it's interesting because for me, it tries to use the ways in which there can be a trustedness and a kind of mistrust of that institution at the same time. I've become really interested recently in a phrase that came to mind, which was the idea of irreverent institutions. The idea of what would it mean to have an institution that actually can both speak with with some sort of voice and also undermine that voice and play with that voice and open up the possibility for imprecision and also you know, kind of not take for granted that an institution has an objective position, which I think they never do.
So elaborate that a little bit. So the you know, the irreverent, if I think about the sort of the irreverent institution, if I think about the sort of irreverent position or the irreverent individual, is often the kind of, you know, on the one hand, the kind of court jester model, right? That is meant to kind of create a kind of escape valve. You know, the one person that can speak, you know, truth to power, that can make fun of the sovereign without fear of losing one's head, right? And so it's often this kind of um, you know, affirmative character within a larger power structure, right? And so I'm curious because I know that you think a lot about power structures, and we're talking a lot about transformation. How do these strategies in your mind, you know, relate to, let's say, more, you know, let's say aggressive or revolutionary mindsets for upsetting or dismantling certain types of power structures versus ones that are more interested, let's say, in a reformist model of transformation that don't want to undo the structure but want to, for lack of a better word, transform it in some sort of incremental way. How does that thinking come into play from the standpoint of the workshops and the education work that you see yourself doing?
Personally, I think that the idea that you can completely upend a structure, I find that in my own, you know, in my own worldview, I don't think it's possible. I think that structures exist. I mean, even when I think about ideas of descaling, the ways in which, you know, society and communication have gotten to such a large scale that we're no longer able to have certain kinds of connections, I don't think you can turn back a clock. You can't go backwards, you can go forwards. But I do think that structures can be changed from within, and they sometimes can be changed from within through methods that actually kind of get under the surface. I mean, I think a lot about, you know, the aesthetic position of something like punk rock is something that was all about provocation. It was all about in your face, kind of what I think of as jaggedness. And you know, if a lot of contemporary life has a smoothness to it, where we're put in positions where we don't even think, we just kind of act. We click a button, we look at a format, we click a one click buy now button. We look at a format that we're totally used to, like an art fair or a TED talk, and we just kind of go for it without thinking about it. I think that this idea of bumpiness is in between. It's where you add friction that lets you slowly change things. I mean, ultimately, it's also how I think about healing, because of course, there are ways in which, in the work of healing, which, I've been talking to a lot of artists who have become therapists as part of my current research at Canal Projects. And somebody recently, one of the people I talked to recently framed healing itself as an artistic act, which I thought was interesting. That, they framed the work of healing as as something that a person does on their own through the assistance of others, but it's a creative act of reintegrating experiences and traumas and challenges. And so, if that's the case, I mean, there are instances where people can be healed like that. They kind of, something happens and it changes entirely. But I think more often, the work of healing is something that happens slowly, and it doesn't always happen. You know, sometimes you have to re-break a bone in order for it to set well. And so I think that it's a back and forth. It's not a linear path. It's something that kind of moves piece to piece. But that's also where, I think that there are methods that may seem like gesture like things, like to get up and do karaoke within either a lecture hall or a museum or somewhere else, may seem buffoonish. But I think it's also a way to get people to engage with each other and their own vulnerability in new ways, to kind of ideally kind of also open things up away from the idea that there's just a single voice who needs to speak at all times.
Sure. I'm curious about this sort of the model of the therapeutic, because it's interesting what you said that there's a model of the therapeutic that happens in kind of one-on-one settings, right? The talking cure, the cognitive behavioral therapy, a person to person or point to point diagrammatically. And then there's the sort of group therapy environment, and then I think that beyond a kind of group dynamic at a certain scale, the therapeutic becomes something different. And I don't know whether that becomes practices of like a, a kind of spiritual practice, if it becomes a kind of religious practice. I don't know what the proper way of thinking about it at scale would look like. But it strikes me because even here where we're looking at the sort of these karaoke moments that are on the screen, a lot of the gatherings, a lot of the convenings, a lot of the things have a particular scale at which they happen, right? I mean, even here on the NSC, a kind of, groups of 10, 15, 20, 30. And I'm curious if in your mind there is the scale matters, right? The number of people changes the dynamic, and if there is a kind of limit that you've seen to work up against in terms of how these kinds of collaborative environments, collective being together, these sort of affective outcomes change, functionally by just simply how many people are engaging in certain types of activities. And then to extend that, what would it mean to sort of put to something like Department of Transformation a goal of a certain scale, right? That like we are going to try and push the boundary where the convenings are really about 50 people and above, or 100 people, and what that begins to look like as you kind of construct or build what now becomes a kind of audience that is something different from being something that can be purely participatory. And again, abstract question, baggy, haven't sort of thought it totally through, but I'm just always sort of curious because it's like the happy medium here is almost the kind of classroom, seminar room environment, which we know kind of has a natural scale to it. I'm curious on your thoughts on scale with regard to these activities.
Thank you. Scale matters so much. I think that one of the big issues in my mind with the way that communication over the last 15 years has changed is, of course, thinking about social media and thinking about the ways in which what used to be small scale conversations have now exploded into a kind of unknown and massive scale where you say a thing that you might once have said in a room of 10 or even 20 people or one on one, and suddenly now everybody is responding to it. And it's no longer in that context. It's no longer within a community and a specific community, and it gets blown up in many ways. I'm really interested in, I don't think scale per se is not a thing that I value. For me, it's not, having 5 people in a room or 50 people in a room. There's not a value differentiation there. It's a question of what kind of conversation do you want to have. Some conversations are best had one-on-one. That's why, a colleague, George Bermudez, a community psychoanalyst, he recently used a phrase that a colleague of his had used, which was the dyadic default. The idea that many kinds of conversations often just by default become 2 people, whether it's the kind of therapeutic or kind of certain partner dynamics or other things. And I think there's something useful about that scale. And then we also have to poke at it a little bit and say, what are the issues with, therapy? What are issues with what I see as its precedents to psychoanalysis, which is, the Catholic confessional? Like, what are the ways in which that controls a certain conversation? But yeah, each scale has a different quality, different timbre somehow. Like 3 people is different from 2, 5 is different from that, 6 is also different. And to me, it's why I am interested maybe in these things that are 50 people below, because they allow for, a little more awareness of the room. And also, oftentimes in these situations, I almost never, as a convener facilitator, keep things at a single scale for an entire gathering. For example, if there are 20 people in a room or 50 people in a room, I will often invite people to actually change that up and go from the scale of 50 people to the scale of 2 people or to the scale of 6 people and then come back. I think that allows for different voices to be heard, and it also changes the kinds of conversations you can have, because at that in this in this kind of large room, you can only do certain things. Personally, I'm still playing with this and working with this. I mean, I haven't, there's that number of 140 that people talk about, the number of people who can be in the community with each other and all know each other personally. And obviously, well, at this point, over the many things we've done, Department of Transformation does have more than 140 people who are kind of part of it in one way or another. But I'm interested in kind of pushing at that, but also being critical about what it means to come together with specific people and in specific ways, and without an attention to scale, with the idea that we can just, kind of move seamlessly from 2 to 2,000. I think we come into a big, big problem.
The previous sort of iteration of Department of Transformation was this kind of itinerant travel around the country, where you would take up residence in various different cities and various different institutions to run workshops and activities. What did you learn about Department of Transformation yourself in these audiences from that experience? And how did location, geography, institutional setting transform the proceedings?
Well, part of it was that I visited parts of the country I'd never been to. I went to Tennessee, I went to Texas, I went to Minnesota, I went to Missouri, I went to different places that I had never engaged with as deeply in terms of thinking about the artistic scenes and what people were doing. So I learned something on the ground just about what are art and design students doing? What are they thinking about? What are the issues that are present for them? But I also learned a lot about people's musical tastes, because we did karaoke in every one of those places. So I learned, what do people request? What are the songs that people want to hear sung? But I also think I learned something about methodologies. I think a lot about questions like introversion and extroversion. How do people kind of interact in a group setting? How do they feel when they're meeting new people? And at what size of a gathering does that make sense? And so I saw how different rooms responded differently, and it helped me, I think, to find methods that could speak to different kinds of people. It kind of gave me more things in my toolkit to try to use when I actually land in a place like here in Jersey City, where I was part of this program that the Centre Pompidou and the Villa Albertine put on, this Night of Ideas. That was actually a really very different and interesting context for me. It was a big public event, but held within the Hudson County Community College. And so the audience there were a lot of students from the community college, other people interested in the arts, people who were coming from Jersey City and the environs. And it ended up being a group that was actually much more engaged in a direct way with some of the activities, whether it was making soil or doing experimental vocal work here with Andros Zins Brown. They were much more open to it than you might see in a gallery setting, in a museum setting where immediately people show up and they're a little bit on guard. They expect to be taught rather than to learn. And I think that kind of openness that happens outside of these kind of really formalized art contexts is something that, for me, I can still learn a lot from, because so much of my life has been so far within these more circumscribed places and communities.
So I'm going to tell the audience that I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're probably getting ready to open it up to questions from the audience. I think there are probably some that have been dropped in the chat, but just if you've got questions for Prem, please prepare them because it may be your turn soon. So I have to ask, why karaoke, and how did karaoke become a kind of, let's say, central tool for what it is that you've been doing in these various different venues and as part of your practice?
Karaoke. Well, I used to hate karaoke when I was younger. I mean, it may come as a surprise, but I am still a pretty awkward person. I was very nervous, and something about getting up and performing, it was always uncomfortable. And so I didn't kind of come out of the gate loving karaoke. Actually, I'm curious, how many people here hate karaoke? Maybe you can raise your hand or put something in the chat if you hate karaoke, and we can see how many people are there. I saw some hands raising. But I've kind of grown. I think what helped me to kind of change, if you love karaoke, it's also great. I think love and hate are both useful emotions because they represent something powerful. For me, things started to change when I realized that karaoke, I think I myself used to think that karaoke was about being on the mic singing. And something changed when I realized that actually karaoke is about everybody in the room. Everybody in a room is doing karaoke. If you're cheering other people on, then you're doing karaoke. If you're sitting quietly in the corner, you're also doing karaoke, because without you, without all the people in a room, there's just somebody in the mirror singing. And so it changed my idea of what karaoke can do. And so I started, and this is definitely a learning from this kind of tour, was to move away from a mode of karaoke that's just about, you get up as a star, and encourage modes of karaoke where people can sing together, where they support each other, where it can be a kind of mode of vulnerability and not trying to be perfect, but actually, trying to fuck up and be human together. I think that, so I think that there are lots of contexts for group singing which have been lost. I think about the role of whether it's church or choir or other places that people used to go to bring their voices together. And we see that that's not the case for a lot of people anymore. And so the contexts for being together in that kind of way are disappearing. And so I think there's something really powerful about bringing it back. Um, and the fact that it lowers the bar to entry. I mean, as a form, you can read things, and so you actually can follow along. You don't have to have prior knowledge. Even if you've never heard a song before, a specific song, you can still follow it somehow. And that was one of my methods when I was on tour. I tried to kick off the karaoke always with a song that I had never sung before. So that helped to really set the bar low. It helped to kind of establish that I'm no more an expert than other people in this, and oftentimes other people knew the songs much better, so they would help me out a little bit. That was useful too.
I have a karaoke anecdote, which also speaks to some of what you're talking about, Prem, which is in Santa Monica, close to where I live, there is a outdoor pedestrian mall called the Third Street Mall, which has gone through various different phases of kind of um, uh, boom and bust. And certainly post-pandemic, it has been trying to go through a period of redevelopment to bring back in storefronts and figure out how to get people back down onto this otherwise public space in Santa Monica. Seemingly the most successful has been the pickleball court, which has been installed inside of one of the storefronts. So I don't know if Department of Transformation has any designs on pickleball as being one of the things it could do, but it seems to be a fast growing communal sport. But one of the things that they do is they've got on weekend evenings free outdoor karaoke kiosks at various different places on the Third Street Mall. And so if you're walking by, people just sign up and perform in public in these various different locations. And the first time I saw it, I thought kind of a remarkable, first of all, there are a lot of amazingly talented singers out there. Maybe it's just Los Angeles and given its music community, but the idea of someone putting themselves out there in this kind of public but semi-anonymous space doing karaoke for free is very much a kind of placemaking and joy-producing activity, even in that setting, which is not otherwise controlled inside of a classroom or a lecture hall or something like that. So public karaoke. All right.
Public karaoke.
Questions. Public karaoke. I'm gonna toss it back to our colleagues at the rail for questions from the audience. But Prem, thank you so much for your such insightful comments and answers to what we've been doing so far.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the questions. That was great.
Hey, Jonathan, that was amazing. Thank you so, so much for your dialogue today. That was such a pleasure to listen to. And we do have a few questions from the audience, if you'll have them. Eleanor is going to ask the first one, which is from GE.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Prem, for this conversation. It's been incredible. I will be asking a question on behalf of GE. GE wrote, how does the shaman and the shamanic enter into the process of transformation, or perhaps a needed metamorphism of groups and individuals? Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, I have to admit that shamanism is not a practice that I have an expert knowledge of. It's something that, I'm aware of, but I guess the place where I've most encountered thinking about shamans is probably through texts like The Spell of the Sensuous from David Abram, in which the shaman is a figure who kind of represents a communication node between the human and the more than human world. Like the shaman on the kind of edge of a society, on the edge of a community, who is kind of mediating between that. And, I guess that in that sense, it makes me think of the shaman. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head. It makes me think of the shaman related to what I think the role of design or curating is, which are also a kind of mediating role. Like both the designer and the curator kind of stand in between, kind of one set of ideas or, a complex belief system or a set of artist practices. And they help to kind of translate that, focus that, and bring that to other people as well. And I guess sometimes, I mean, I'm very interested in group context and kind of group movement. But I think that it's probably true that sometimes having that focusing point, having, one of the things I think is very important about both curating and design is the role of subjectivity in them. Is in both cases, that curating is not an objective thing. It's not about, there is a level of expertise in it, but I'm most interested in curators and designers who actually are open and vulnerable about their own subject positions, what they're bringing to it. And maybe that's why, for me, that idea of the shaman, as you're asking, is interesting, because they are a physical figure. They are mediating, but it's their body that is doing it, and they are necessarily bringing a part of them to it. So I guess as much as you can be clear and open about that, I think that's a powerful move.
Thanks, GE, for the question, and thank you, Prem.
Thank you, GE, and thanks, Eleanor, for asking that question on GE's behalf. I'm going to ask the next question. Prem, I'm really curious to know a little bit more about working in residence at Canal Projects specifically. As in your work, you've collaborated with lots of different institutions, and many of them across different disciplines. And what does it mean to your work to work in that specific context? And has it unlocked anything for you at this time in your explorations?
I think that, Sarah Gartzon, who is one of the curators at Canal Projects, and Summer Guthrie, the director, they actually helped me to give language to it. When they invited me and Department of Transformation to be in residence at Canal Projects, they said, oh, we think of you as being our Department of Transformation. That is to say, like, by being embedded within the institution, you can kind of slightly change things. And that for me was a really powerful reframing, because I understood suddenly, maybe part of the reason why Department of Transformation has been moving around these contexts and going and engaging with different institutions is because it can kind of dock into those things for a certain period of time, learn from that context, and hopefully give something back, and then continue on. And so that role, as it being almost like para-institutional within the kind of our art language, I think is something I want to explore further, because and it does come out of my work as a designer and a curator as well. I mean, you never work in a vacuum, as a designer nor as a curator. And so I am more comfortable. I'm actually probably less comfortable when somebody just says, pie in the sky, what do you want to do? Like, give me a big idea. That's not really the way that I work. I have a set of interests that motivate me and that motivate the Department of Transformation. But when somebody says, well, we'd like you to come here, then it gives me the opportunity to respond to something, to be in dialogue with it. And I find it more generative for my own thinking than just thinking in a vacuum.
I love that answer. Thank you so much. And thanks for answering the question. The last question today is going to be from Fong at the Rail. Fong, I'll give you the chance to unmute to ask.
Thank you, Prem. Thank you, Jonathan. This is terrific. I was in a few meetings, so I missed most of the talk, but I will definitely listen to the whole thing when I start the portrait in the weekend. Yeah, for sure. First of all, I want to thank also Jonathan for his brilliant interview with Paul Pfeiffer. I read it 3 times.
Oh, thanks, Fong.
Yeah, I texted you, but no availability from you.
What? I have not received a text from you. That's impossible.
Oh man! So, Prem, congratulations. Question is super simple. We share this admiration, deep admiration for Brian O'Doherty, and you helped to reestablish his reputation to some extent. And the question is similar to what you've been talking about a little bit here, the whole concept of Sir Isaiah Berlin, the hedgehog, and the fox. The hedgehog is somebody who can really do one thing and one thing well. And the fox can't really declare one thing that would, boil the world down in that very singular vision. So in the visual culture, you can say that Bob Ryman or Ernest Martin is a classic hedgehog, whereas Joseph Beuys or Louis Bourgeois are classic foxes. And Alfred Royal Doherty seemed to function more identifiably with the latter, the fox. He has so many different personality, and every single one of them he did well, whether it was a TV host way before Charlie Rose. When he first came to Boston, he was a doctor, for Christ's sake, trained in Trinity College, and then became an art critic for New York Times, and then the director of the NEA, and then he wrote novel under a few pen names, William Bode, and criticism under Mary Josephson, and make art under Patrick Ireland. It's insane. It's so inspiring.
Totally.
What's the question? Can you share your own view and your own admiration and friendship with Brian, and how much that resonate with your own worldview in what you do?
Well, yeah, we do share that. Brian was an amazing friend and mentor and model and human being. I do think that, this question of the fox and the hedgehog is interesting because I see it rather than being a dichotomy, fox or hedgehog, it's more like a gradient or even an oscillation. I think that if you look at, I used to also characterize, some of the artists whom I really admired, somebody like Karl Martens, or, other people who really have worked in a singular line for many, many, many decades. Versus, or I used to set up a dichotomy between them and, again, people like Brian, who had many different career trajectories that overlaid and overlapped. And I think I've come to realize that, yeah, it's not one or the other. It's simply a question of scale and periodicity. Somebody like Karl Martens has changes within his own body of work, but they're simply, they're maybe more visible at a minute resolution. An Kawara is a very good example for me. An Kawara, whose work I've thought a lot about and I've written about, I used to think of his work as being this kind of, totally monolithic one body of work over time. But actually, in really delving into that work, I realized there is an absolute transformation that happens. It's just very small, and you see it within the lettering of his paintings and how it changes. But it's all a question of how you zoom in. And I think the thing that I probably learned most from Brian, and I am so, indebted to his friendship in this, is I think particularly at a moment when, when I was younger, I was, there was a moment in time where I was trying to be a really good graphic designer. I really wanted to prove to myself and to other people that I could be a really good graphic designer. And then I wanted to prove that I could be a good curator, and I wanted to prove these things. And but I also always felt like you were only allowed to do one thing. And I think it was Brian who said to me, he was the person who encouraged me to write, for example. And he said, Prem, you don't have to choose one or the other. People may think that if you try to do multiple things, you can't be good in all of them. But actually, it doesn't matter. It's not about being good in those things. It's about doing them and caring about them. And he said, so write. You should write then. And I think now that I've come to something like Department of Transformation, which about Department of Transformation, and that was very powerful. He actually he immediately got it, and he was like, yes, this makes sense as the next thing you're doing, bringing together all the work that you've been doing. And actually, I haven't thought about this in that way, but yeah, he really encouraged me to embrace that transformation on both the personal level, but also on a larger level. In his work, not only as an artist and writer, but also, as you said, at the NEA, supporting other artists, trying to make radical decisions about what kind of art could be taking place in the world today. I think he was trying to work on that individual and on that structural level that I so champion. And so, yeah, I'd like to spend more time thinking about that. Thank you, Phong.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about Brian a lot. We pay a huge tribute when he passed away. And I remember once we have a lengthy conversation with Barbara Novak, his brilliant partner, about the similarity between Tagore and Tolstoy philosophy, art and education, you know, about individualism, naturalism, spiritualism, and internationalism, whereas teacher-centered philosophies, student-centered philosophy, society-centered philosophy ought to be integrated. And it's interesting to go back to Sir Isaiah Berlin again, not just the hedgehog and the fox, but also two concepts of liberty, positive liberty and negative liberty. You can't really embrace one and neglect the other, you know, so thank you so much. Yeah, I can't wait to catch up with both of you super soon. And I think there's going to be a huge celebration at 99 Canal. They've been doing very interesting things, so I get to see you there soon. We get to see you. And thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. I call you a bit later. Thank you, Bram. And
Thank you, Phong.
delighted.
Thanks,
Thank
Prem.
you, guys.
Thanks, Phong.
Go back to can't wait. Back to you, Chloe.
Before you gotta stay on. You might miss the best part.
Oh, okay. I think
Or the worst part, depends.
Or the worst part.
Well, Chloe, did you want to jump in with something, or?
Yeah, that concludes today's Q&A, and I just want to say thank you to everyone for your questions, which were really lovely to hear and to listen to. And thank you, Prem, for answering all our questions. We have a very special performance to conclude today, so I'm going to let Prem and Jonathan introduce it, and then we're going to invite all of you to take part in it as well.
So, yeah, thank you, Chloe. And thank you, Jonathan, for agreeing to be part of a little hijinks. I mean, after all this talk of karaoke, it would seem irresponsible to not practice what you preach. And so, yeah, as Chloe said, we're inviting everyone, if they want, to unmute themselves. And we decided, Jonathan and I decided, that we would model doing karaoke in vulnerable ways by doing a karaoke song that at least I myself have never sung before. Have you sung this before, Jonathan?
I have never sung this as karaoke. I would never be so
Okay.
foolish except for the rail.
Okay, so for the you know, for posterity's sake, for being recorded forever, we wanted to try one thing. And I would also actually, before we do that, I just invite everyone to, if you want, take a deep breath.
Yeah, so I'm
Close
gonna
your eyes.
unmute, and everyone has the
Ex-
option to unmute.
Exactly. So just take a moment and gather yourself, gather your energy. Breathe in and breathe out. And maybe we can have a little singing together. So, Chloe, do you want to fire us up?
Here we go.
Let's see how this works. I'm going to stand up too.
Yeah.
Okay,
Stand up
Jonathan,
here.
and
This
everybody
is
else.
Boom ba da, boom ba ba, boom ba ba day. Pressure pushing down on me, pressing down on you. No man that's born under pressure. Burns a building down, splits a family in two, puts people on the streets. But
That's okay.
That's okay. Tell what this world's about. Watching my good friends let me out tomorrow. gets me higher. Pressure on the beat. People on the streets. Yeah, okay. Around again, my friends on the floor. It's on the place. It never rains, but it pours through no. Eat that bata. No. People on the streets. People on the streets. The devil knowing what this world is about. Watching some girlfriend screaming, let me out. Tomorrow gets me high.
On the street.
Turn away from it all like a bad man. Sat on a fence, but it didn't work. Keep coming up for love, but it's so slashed and torn. Why? Insanity laughs under pressure, we're breaking. Can we give ourselves one more chance? Why can't we give love that one more chance? Why can't we give love? Give love, give love, give love, give love, give love, give love, give love. Love's such an old-fashioned perfect to care. The people on the edge of the night and the days you to change your way of caring about us. This is our last dance. This is ourselves. Under pressure. Pressure.
Wow.
Okay.
Oh my lord.
That was amazing. What?
Thank you, everyone.
Wow.
Okay. And
That
with
was incredible.
Wow. That is
I'm, yeah, that was
I have
just,
no idea how that sounded.
there are no words.
wow. Under
Doesn't
pressure.
matter. It felt good.
That's right. That's right.
Here's the
Thank
love.
You fail.
Raymond Jonathan.
Prem,
Yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you, Prem.
love it.
Thank you,
Thank
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you so
Has the
much.
mic
More love.
open?
More
I
love.
you,
encourage everyone to
Jonathan.
say hello and goodbye as you head out
Yeah.
today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Thank
Great conversation.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
Prem.
Beautiful
Thanks, Chloe. Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you, Prem.
Can't
Thank you,
wait to catch
Jonathan.
you again soon at
I
Canal
will
Project.
read you.
See
Bye,
ya.
you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Dear
The
Canal
power of
Projects.
transformation.
Bye, everyone.